My father crawled to me in tears, begging for help with his illness. I left my wife for him and threw the ring into the river. She found my money, got furious, and decided to teach him. I met Morgan back in college. She was everything I wasn't, energetic, passionate, and fiercely independent. I, on the other hand, was the quiet guy who kept to himself, content with a good book or a marathon gaming session instead of a night out. Somehow, despite our differences, we clicked. Morgan brought a kind of energy into my life that I didn't even know I needed, and I, in turn, grounded her when the chaos of the world became too much. We balanced each other out, and for a while, it felt perfect. By our 4th year of dating, we were already planning our future. We'd talk about getting married, maybe buying a little house near the coast where we could hear the waves crash in the evenings. It felt like we were building something solid, something that would last forever. But life has a way of throwing wrenches into the best-laid plans. For us, it was my job at the family restaurant. It started about a year into our relationship. My dad had been running the restaurant for as long as I could remember, but when he fell ill, I stepped in to help. At first, it felt like the right thing to do, the only thing to do. The hours were long and grueling, especially during the evening shifts, but I didn't mind. It was my family's legacy, and I wanted to keep it going, both for my dad and for the family name. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me a sense of purpose. I told myself that Morgan would understand. And at first, she did. She knew how much the restaurant meant to me and never wanted to get in the way of my responsibilities. But as time went on, her patience began to wear thin. The late nights became a bigger issue than either of us expected. We couldn't take spontaneous trips like we used to. Even weekday dinners were a rarity. More often than not, I'd be stuck at the restaurant until well past midnight, only to come home and find Morgan already asleep. We started going days without truly seeing each other. And when we did, it felt like we were passing strangers, just brushing against each other's lives for brief moments. The connection we'd once shared felt like it was slowly unraveling, thread by thread. Then, 3 months before we were supposed to get married, it all came to a head. We had planned a quiet evening in, just the two of us. No phones, no distractions. I'd promised her I'd leave work early. She was excited, and I could tell how much it meant to her. But the evening rush came, and with it, chaos. The restaurant was slammed. I couldn't leave. I'd already been there all day, but there was just too much to do, and I felt obligated to stay. I sent Morgan a text apologizing, promising I'd make it up to her, but she never replied. By the time I got home, it was well past midnight. The lights were still on, and Morgan was waiting for me. She stood in the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. "You promised," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that hit me like a brick. Her eyes flashed with frustration, the kind that had been building for months. "You promised we would have tonight. But you chose the restaurant over me. Again." I sighed, guilt washing over me like a tide. "Morgan, I'm sorry," I started. "You know how it—" She cut me off with a sharp shake of her head. "No, don't. I've heard it before. I know how it works. It's always the same story. The restaurant needs you. The staff is short. The customers are upset. There's always something." I opened my mouth to respond, but she wasn't done. "When does it stop, huh? When do I get to come first?" Her voice cracked, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. "We're supposed to get married, and I don't even know if I can count on you to show up for that." Her words stunned me into silence. I wanted to say something, anything, to fix it. But deep down, I knew she wasn't wrong. Morgan wiped at her eyes and looked away. "I can't keep doing this, Ethan. I can't be the second choice in my own relationship." I took a step closer, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "I love you," I said, the words feeling hollow even as they left my mouth. She let out a bitter laugh. "Do you? Because it doesn't feel like it." That night, Morgan slept on the couch. And for the first time, I wondered if all the sacrifices I was making for the restaurant were worth losing the one person who made me feel truly alive. "There's so much to do," I said, my voice faltering. "I didn't want to cancel on you." Morgan's eyes narrowed, her voice rising slightly. "It's always the restaurant, Alex. You never have time for me anymore. And don't give me that 'I didn't want to cancel' crap. You could have come home at a reasonable hour, but you didn't. You stayed there. You always stay there." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I stood there, caught off guard, realizing just how bad things had gotten. I hadn't meant to make her feel this way, neglected, like she was an afterthought, but clearly my excuses weren't cutting it anymore. "I'm doing this for us, Morgan," I said, my tone urgent, as if I could make her understand. "I'm trying to build a future here. This restaurant, it's our future. Don't you see that?" Morgan looked at me, disappointment etched into every feature of her face. "I don't want a future that comes at the expense of the present, Alex," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I want a partner, not someone who's always at work. The restaurant has always been there, but I need you here. I need you. Not your promises, not your apologies, but you." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had thought we were fighting about tonight, one bad evening, one broken promise. But this wasn't just about tonight. This was about everything. It was about me choosing the restaurant over her, time and time again, and expecting her to be okay with it. "I can't just quit, Morgan," I said, my voice softer now, almost pleading. "You know how important this place is to my family. It's not just a job. It's—" "I get that, Alex," she cut in, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. "But what about us? What about me? You said you wanted this future with me, but all I see is you working yourself into the ground for something that doesn't even include me." Her words stung, each one cutting deeper than the last. I opened my mouth to speak, to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt so tangled up, so impossibly complicated. I loved her more than anything, but I couldn't just walk away from my family's business. Too many people were relying on me. "I can work with you, Morgan," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. My mind raced, grasping for a solution. "I could take fewer shifts, help you at the shop, manage things together. Maybe we could make it work." Morgan shook her head slowly, her hands falling limply to her sides. "I don't need you to work with me, Alex," she said quietly, her voice heavy with sadness. "I don't need to be your project. I need a partner, someone who actually makes time for me. And right now, I'm starting to wonder if that's something you're even capable of." Her words knocked the wind out of me. It felt like the ground beneath me had shifted, leaving me unsteady, unsure of where I stood. I had always thought we were on the same page, that our future together was solid, unshakable. But now, for the first time, I questioned if we were chasing the same dream. Was I really putting the restaurant ahead of her? Was I failing her as a partner? The silence between us stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Morgan's tear-filled eyes searched mine, but I didn't have the answers she needed. We had always been a team, balanced, inseparable, like two halves of a whole. But now, standing there in the strained quiet of our living room, I could feel the distance between us growing. And for the first time, I wasn't sure we could find our way back. We used to be able to talk things through, to find our way back to each other after a fight. But now, it felt like we were miles apart, like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bridge the distance between us. I wanted to fix it, to make it right again, but I had no idea how. The more I tried, the further away she seemed. After that night, things between Morgan and me were never the same. The fight didn't just fade away. It lingered, like a storm cloud that wouldn't blow over. We both tried to act like everything was fine, to keep up the appearance of normalcy, but the cracks in our relationship were spreading, growing wider with each passing day. About a week after our argument, Morgan came home from work unusually quiet. Normally, she would greet me with a smile, or at least a hug, but tonight she just walked past me, her footsteps hollow in the silence. I stood there for a moment, confused and anxious, before following her. My stomach was already in knots. "Hey, you okay?" I asked carefully, leaning against the doorframe to the kitchen, watching her place her bag down on the counter. She didn't answer right away, not even a glance in my direction. "We need to talk," she said, her voice flat, like she was reading off a script she had written in her head hours ago. Those 4 words hit me like a freight train, knocking the breath out of me. My heart rate spiked, and I tried to prepare myself for what was coming, though deep down I had a feeling I already knew. "Okay," I said, forcing myself to stay calm even as panic began to rise in my chest. "What's on your mind?" She turned to face me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her body language defensive, closed off. I could see the hurt in her eyes, and the anger too. "I've been thinking about us," she started, her voice wavering slightly, "about everything. And I don't think I can do this anymore, Alex." I froze. My mind went blank for a moment as I struggled to process the weight of her words. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight with disbelief. "You can't do this." "Morgan, we're planning a wedding. We've been together for 4 years. You can't just—" She cut me off, her voice trembling as she spoke again, quieter this time. "I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with this. Your job, your schedule, it's not just a small issue anymore. It's our whole life, and I've tried to be patient. I've tried to understand, but I can't keep waiting for something to change when it never does." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I had never considered that this was going to be the breaking point. I took a step closer, my voice low, almost pleading. "Morgan, you knew what my life was like before we got engaged. You knew about the hours, the responsibilities. Why is this suddenly such a big deal now?" Her eyes softened for a moment, but the frustration was still there, simmering beneath the surface. "Because I thought things would be different. I thought, once we got serious, once we started planning a future together, you'd realize how important it is to actually be present. But you haven't, Alex. And I don't think you ever will." Her words stung, deep and raw. They hit me harder than anything she'd ever said before, harder than all the little comments, all the passive-aggressive remarks. This was different. This was the end. "That's not fair, Morgan," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I've been doing everything I can to support us, to build a future for us. You think this job is just about me? It's about us. It's about providing for our life together. I thought you understood that." "I did," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But it's not enough anymore. I need more than just financial stability, Alex. I need someone who's there for me, who prioritizes me. And right now, I don't feel like I'm even on your radar." The room spun for a moment, like the walls were closing in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at her, watching her break down before me, and feeling like the ground beneath me was crumbling away. "Morgan, She shook her head slowly, cutting me off. Her tears were barely contained now, her shoulders shaking. "I don't want to hear it, Alex. I don't want to hear any more excuses. I need something real. I need someone who's here, not just in the same house, but with me. And I can't keep doing this if you're not willing to make a change." I stood there, feeling utterly helpless. I loved her. I wanted this to work. But what if my choices, my job, my family's expectations, had taken us past the point of no return? What if we were too far gone? Her words rang in my ears, echoing in the space between us. "I need someone who's here for me." I didn't have an answer. Not then. Not ever. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My chest tightened, and my mind raced to process her words. "So what? You're just giving up?" I asked, my voice rising. "After everything we've been through, you're throwing it all away because you don't like my job?" Her face crumpled, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might change her mind. But then she straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening, and said the words that would haunt me for months to come. "I think we should break up." I let out a bitter laugh, more out of disbelief than anything else. "Break up? You're serious? You're willing to walk away from 4 years together because of my work schedule? Do you even hear how ridiculous that sounds?" She flinched at my words, but she didn't back down. "It's not just about the schedule, Alex," she said, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "It's about feeling like I'm always going to come second. And I can't live like that anymore." Her words hit like a punch to the gut, but instead of backing down, I felt anger rising in my chest. "So what? You're just going to bail?" I snapped. "After everything I've sacrificed for us? You're going to throw it all away because you're too selfish to see the bigger picture?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought I might have broken through. But she shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not being selfish, Alex. I'm choosing myself because you won't. And I'm sorry if that hurts you, but I can't keep sacrificing my happiness for something that isn't working." Her words left me reeling. This was Morgan, the woman I had planned to spend my life with, The woman I thought I knew better than anyone. And now she was walking away because I worked too much? It felt like a betrayal on every possible level. What about the wedding? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. What about everything we've been planning? You're just going to throw all that away, too? She hesitated, and for a moment, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe she'd reconsider. Maybe this wasn't really happening. But then she spoke, her voice quiet yet resolute. It's better to end things now than to go through with something that's only going to make us both miserable. I stared at her, stunned. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And what? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You think we can just go back to being friends after this? Is that what you want? She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to lose you completely, Alex. I still care about you. I just don't think we can be together anymore. Her words felt like a knife to the chest, twisting deeper with every syllable. Friends, I said, shaking my head bitterly. You think I can just sit around and watch you move on with your life while I'm stuck here picking up the pieces? You've got to be kidding me, Morgan. She didn't respond. The silence between us was deafening, suffocating. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to do something, anything, to make her understand how much she was hurting me. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, as my entire world came crashing down around me. Finally, I managed to speak, my voice low and cold. If you walk out that door, don't expect me to be here when you come back. Her breath caught, and for a second, I thought she might stay. But then she reached for her bag, her movements slow, almost hesitant. I'm sorry, Alex, she whispered, her voice breaking. I really am. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out. I stood there in the empty apartment, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. The door clicked shut, and with it, something inside me shattered. She was gone. And for the first time, I realized I might have lost her for good. You don't get to break my heart and then expect me to wait for you on the other side. That's not how this works. You can't destroy me and then ask to be my friend. Morgan just nodded, tears spilling down her face in silent streams. I understand, she whispered, barely audible. I'm sorry, Alex. And with that, she turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving me standing there, shattered, gutted, completely alone. I thought the worst part of breaking up with her would be the moment she walked out the door. I figured the initial shock of realizing it was over would be the hardest. But I was so wrong. The real pain came after, in the days that followed. She didn't move out. Instead, she lingered, haunting the apartment like a ghost of everything we'd once had. Every little thing she did became a fresh wound, a reminder of what I'd lost. The very next morning, I woke up to the clinking of mugs in the kitchen. For a blissful, fleeting second, it felt like just another day, like nothing had changed. But then reality hit me like a truck. We weren't fine. We weren't anything anymore. I stumbled into the kitchen, still half asleep, and there she was. Sitting at the table with a steaming cup of coffee, she gave me this small, hesitant smile, like she was testing the waters. Morning, she said softly, like we hadn't just destroyed each other less than 12 hours ago. I had no idea how to react. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand why she was still here. But another part, the part clinging to the ridiculous hope that this was all some terrible mistake, just nodded, grabbed a mug, and poured my coffee in silence. The days that followed were unbearable. We tiptoed around each other like strangers in a shared space. I'd go to work, and when I came home, I'd find her sprawled on the couch watching TV or scrolling endlessly on her phone in the bedroom. It was like she had no intention of leaving. At first, I tried to cut her some slack. I told myself maybe she needed time to find a place, maybe she was figuring things out. But as days turned into weeks, my patience thinned to nothing. 2 weeks after the breakup, I finally reached my limit. I walked into the living room one evening and found her curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at me as I stepped into the room, her expression guarded, like she knew what was coming. Morgan, I started, forcing my voice to stay steady, we need to talk. She sat up slowly, folding the blanket neatly across her lap. Okay, she said carefully. What's on your mind? I took a deep breath, steeling myself. You can't stay here anymore. This is my apartment, and I think it's time for you to move out. Her face crumpled for just a moment, and she looked genuinely hurt. "Alex," she said, her voice soft, almost pleading, "I know this is awkward, but I just need a little more time. I am looking for a place. I swear. I just haven't found anything yet." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorway, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Morgan, it's been 2 weeks. You've had plenty of time to at least start making arrangements. You can't just stay here forever. It's not fair. Not to you, and definitely not to me." She bit her lip, her eyes darting away from mine. "I know it's not ideal," she murmured, almost to herself. "But where am I supposed to go? You know I don't have family nearby," she said, her voice trembling. "And all my friends either live too far away or don't have the space." I let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through my hair. "Look, I'm not trying to be the bad guy here, Morgan. I get that this is hard. But it's not my job to figure out where you go. You're the one who ended this. You decided we weren't working, so it's on you to figure out the next step." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt myself wavering. But then the memory of all those sleepless nights came rushing back, the nights I spent staring at the ceiling, torn apart by the sight of her every day, knowing she didn't want me anymore. I couldn't keep living like this. "I'll give you until the end of the month," I said, forcing my voice to stay firm. "That's 2 more weeks. After that, you need to be out." She nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll figure something out." I thought that was it. That we'd finally reached some kind of resolution. But with Morgan, things were never that simple. In the days that followed, she started acting different. She cooked dinner for both of us, something she hadn't done in months, even though I never asked her to. She left little notes around the apartment, things like, "Hope you have a great day," smiley face, or "Don't forget your lunch." At first, I thought it was just her way of being nice, a way to ease the awkwardness between us. But then, I started noticing other things. How she'd linger in the kitchen while I made coffee, pretending to busy herself with nothing in particular. Or how she'd casually bring up old memories, like she was trying to pull me back into the past. One night, as we sat eating the pasta she'd made, she looked up at me and said, "Do you ever think about how things used to be? You know, before all the fights, before everything." I froze, my fork suspended halfway to my mouth. "What are you talking about, Morgan?" She shrugged, twirling her pasta around her fork like it was no big deal. I miss us, Alex. I miss the way we used to be." I set my fork down, my appetite vanishing. "Morgan, stop. You can't do this. You're the one who ended things, remember? You're the one who said this wasn't working." "I know," she said quickly, her eyes wide and earnest. "I know, and I still think it was the right decision. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you. It doesn't mean I don't miss you." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "Morgan, if you really care about me, then do what I'm asking. Move out. Let me move on." Her gaze dropped to her plate, her shoulders slumping as she mumbled, "I will. I promise." But by then, promises from Morgan didn't carry much weight anymore. A few days later, I came home from work to find her sitting at the dining table. Her head was bowed, her expression unreadable. In front of her, the engagement ring I had given her rested on the table. That ring, it was beautiful, custom-designed, with a diamond that had cost me months of savings. At the time, it had felt like the perfect symbol of our future together. Now, it was just a stark reminder of everything that had fallen apart. I had spent more than I'd like to admit on that ring. Months of savings poured into it because I thought it symbolized our future. At the time, it felt like a promise of everything we were building together. Now, sitting there on the table, it just felt like a cruel reminder of how far we'd fallen. "I've been thinking about this," Morgan said, motioning toward the ring. Her voice was quiet, her expression impossible to read. "I know you probably want it back." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Yeah, I do." She pushed it across the table toward me, her hand lingering for a moment before she pulled it away. "Here," she said, her tone flat. "I don't want to keep something that's just going to remind me of what we lost." I reached out, picking up the ring. It felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of it carried all the love, the pain, and the regrets between us. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Morgan hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "For what it's worth, Alex, I really did love you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I still do, in a way. I'm sorry it had to end like this." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the idea that some part of her still cared. But I also knew that caring alone had never been enough. "Me too," I said finally, slipping the ring into my pocket. "But it doesn't change anything." After Morgan moved out, I thought I'd finally feel some relief, some semblance of peace. But instead, the apartment felt colder and emptier than I ever could have imagined. Her perfume still lingered faintly on the couch cushions. Her favorite coffee mug sat untouched in the back of the cupboard. And every corner of the place seemed to echo with memories of her, like she was still there, haunting the life we used to share. Determined to move forward, I started cleaning out her things. I packed them into boxes and left them by the door for her to pick up. One evening, as I went through the drawers in our shared desk to reorganize, I stumbled across something unexpected, a small leather-bound journal. At first, I didn't know whose it was. It looked practically brand new, barely worn, and I couldn't remember ever seeing Morgan write in a diary. But when I opened it, her handwriting was unmistakable. My initial instinct was to close it and put it back. Whatever was inside wasn't meant for me. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the anger I was still carrying, the unresolved frustration of how everything had fallen apart. Or maybe it was just plain curiosity. Whatever it was, I couldn't stop myself. I flipped to the first page. The entries started out harmless enough. She wrote about her day, her work, little things we did together, our dates, inside jokes, random memories. For a moment, it felt like peeking into a simpler, happier time. But as I kept reading, the tone began to shift. A different picture started to take shape, one I hadn't seen coming. The woman I thought I knew so well had been wrestling with thoughts and feelings she'd kept hidden. One entry, dated about 6 months before our breakup, stopped me cold. "Alex is a good guy. Everyone says that, and I know it's true. He's sweet, dependable, and hardworking. But sometimes, I feel like that's all there is to him. I don't know if that's enough for me. Am I terrible for thinking that?" I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. My heart sank. Was this how she'd felt all along? Had she been questioning us for months while I was blissfully unaware? My hands trembled as I flipped to the next entry, desperate for answers. "We went to dinner with my friends tonight, and Alex barely said a word. I know he's shy, but it's so frustrating sometimes. I feel like I'm constantly making excuses for him. They all ask me why I'm with someone so boring." That word stopped me cold. Boring. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always known I wasn't the most outgoing or exciting guy. But I thought Morgan loved me for who I was, quiet, steady, dependable. Clearly, I'd been wrong. I kept reading, even as each word felt like another blow. The entries grew more pointed, more critical. She wrote about how my job consumed me, how she felt neglected and unimportant. But the most devastating entry was the one where she first admitted to herself that she was thinking about ending things. "I don't think I can do this anymore. I've tried to be patient, to make this work, but I feel like I'm losing myself. Alex is never going to change, and I can't keep waiting for something that isn't going to happen. I need to start thinking about what I want, about what makes me happy. Maybe it's time to let go." The date on the entry was 2 months before our breakup. She had already made up her mind, and yet, she stayed. She smiled at me, kissed me, curled up next to me in bed, knowing all the while that she was planning to leave. The thought made my stomach churn. Still, I couldn't stop. I kept reading, even as the words cut deeper with every page. In one entry, she wrote about her guilt. "Alex deserves better than this. He's a good person, and he doesn't deserve to be with someone who doesn't love him the way he loves me. But how do I tell him? How do I break his heart without completely destroying him?" Her words blurred as I stared at the page. My throat tightened, and I had to blink back the sting of tears. The final entries were the hardest to read. By then, she had convinced herself that breaking up was the right decision. But it wasn't her resolve that broke me. It was the way she reflected on why she had fallen for me in the first place. "When I first met Alex, I was drawn to him because he was so different from anyone I'd ever dated. He was safe, reliable, everything I thought I wanted. But now I realize I fell in love with the idea of him, not the real him. I wanted someone who would ground me, who would make me feel secure. But now that I have that, I feel trapped. I don't know if I ever really loved him, or if I just loved the idea of him. Those words shattered me. She hadn't loved me, not the way I thought she had. She had loved the version of me she created in her head. The version that fit into her life, her plans, her vision of what she thought she needed. But the real me, the person I truly was, that wasn't enough for her. Morgan had loved a version of me that only existed in her mind, a polished, idealized version I could never live up to. And when reality didn't align with her expectations, she chose to leave. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. A storm of emotions surged through me, anger, sadness, betrayal. But underneath it all, there was an emptiness I couldn't ignore. Everything I thought I knew about our relationship, about her, had been flipped on its head. 4 years. For years I had spent building a life with someone who didn't truly love me, someone who never really saw me for who I was. For a long time, I just sat there, staring blankly at the journal. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone and call her, to demand an explanation. But what good would that do? She had already said everything she needed to say in those pages. There was nothing left to discuss. Instead, I made a choice. I decided to focus on myself. I couldn't change the past or undo the hurt she had caused, but I could move forward. I could take this pain and use it to grow. I could become the person I wanted to be, not for her or anyone else, but for me. Looking back, I realized our relationship had been doomed from the start. Morgan and I were never truly compatible. We had different needs, different expectations, different visions for the future. I had been willing to overlook those differences, to make compromises, but she hadn't. In a strange way, finding her journal was a blessing in disguise. It gave me the closure I needed, the clarity to see the truth for what it was. Morgan didn't love the real me. But that didn't mean I was unworthy of love. It just meant I needed to find someone who would love me for who I was, flaws and all. As I packed the journal away with the rest of her things, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't consumed by anger or sadness. Instead, I felt hopeful. The relationship was over, but my story wasn't. After Morgan left, I thought life would finally start to settle down. But I was wrong. Apparently, our breakup wasn't just between the two of us, it had become everyone else's business too. My phone buzzed constantly with messages. Friends, family, even people I barely knew, all wanting to know what had happened. At first, I didn't understand why, but it didn't take long to figure it out. Morgan had been telling her side of the story to anyone who would listen. The first red flag came when my mom called. I hadn't talked to her much about the breakup, I didn't want to relive it, but the concern in her voice was unmistakable. "Alex," she started, her tone hesitant but serious. "I just got off the phone with Morgan." I closed my eyes, already bracing for what was coming. "Okay. And?" "She's really upset," my mom continued, her voice tight with worry. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Of course she is, Mom. Breakups are hard." "No," she said sharply. "I mean, she told me you were working too much. That you were ignoring her. She said you refused to compromise," my mom continued, her voice hesitant but firm. "She felt like you didn't care about her anymore." Her words hit me like a slap. My stomach twisted with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That's not true," I said firmly, my voice rising. "Morgan broke up with me because she decided she didn't love me the way she thought she did. She told me that herself." "Well, that's not the story she's telling," my mom replied, her tone careful. "She's making it sound like you were neglecting her, like you were the one who pushed her away." I stared at her, stunned. Morgan had spun the breakup into some kind of sob story, and now I was the villain. "Mom, you know me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you really think I'd treat her like that?" "I don't," she said quickly, leaning forward. "But other people might, especially if they're only hearing her side of things." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just Morgan venting to her friends. She was rewriting the narrative, painting herself as the victim and casting me as the bad guy. I was her scapegoat. The next few days were a nightmare. My phone buzzed, and I saw it was my friend Lucas. His tone was cautious when I answered. "Hey man," he said. "I just wanted to check in. I heard about you and Morgan." "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "It's been rough." Lucas hesitated, and I could tell he didn't want to say what was coming next. "Look, I don't want to make things worse, but she's been saying some stuff about you. Like, that you were ignoring her and refusing to make time for her." My jaw tightened. "I didn't believe it," Lucas added quickly, "but some of the others? They're starting to take her side." A wave of frustration swept over me. Lucas was one of the few people I knew I could trust, but even so, the fact that people were questioning my character was like a punch to the gut. "Lucas," I said, my voice strained, "you know me. You've seen how much I put into that relationship. She's twisting the truth to make herself look better." "I believe you," he said firmly. "I just thought you should know what's going around." "Thanks," I muttered, hanging up. But after the call, I felt like the walls were closing in. Everywhere I turned, it seemed like someone else had heard Morgan's version of the breakup. Even at work, I noticed the shift co-workers giving me sympathetic looks, awkward silences when I walked into the break room. It was like I'd been branded. But the worst part, that came when Morgan got my mom involved again. One afternoon, I stopped by my parents' house for dinner, hoping for a little normalcy, a brief escape from the chaos. But as soon as I walked in, I could feel the tension. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table, her arms crossed, a worried expression on her face. "Alex," she said, her tone serious, "we need to talk." I sighed, dropping my keys on the counter. "What now?" "It's about Morgan," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "She called me again. She said you're being cold and unkind to her, that you're refusing to help her move on." I froze, my frustration boiling over. "Are you serious right now?" I snapped, unable to hold back any longer. "Mom, she's the one who dumped me. She's the one who stayed in my apartment for weeks, refusing to leave. And now, she's out here playing the victim." My mom looked taken aback, but to her credit, she let me vent without interrupting. "She's making it sound like you're punishing her for ending things," she said carefully. I want to make sure you're okay." "I'm not okay." I shot back, my voice cracking. "I'm trying to rebuild my life after she tore it apart. And now she's out there spreading lies about me to anyone who will listen. Do you have any idea how hard that is?" My mom's expression softened, and she reached out to squeeze my hand. "I didn't know it was that bad," she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. "But you have to understand. Morgan sounded really upset. She said she felt like you were shutting her out." "Of course she's upset," I said bitterly. "She's upset because she didn't get to walk away from this looking like the perfect, innocent victim. She's upset because I didn't just roll over and let her control the narrative." My mom nodded slowly, her expression shifting as if she was finally starting to piece everything together. "I won't interfere anymore," she said quietly. "I just hate seeing you go through this." "Thanks, Mom," I muttered, feeling a small weight lift off my chest. "I appreciate it." But even with my mom promising to back off, the pressure from other people didn't stop. Morgan's friends started messaging me. Some of them came right out and accused me of being a terrible partner. One message read, "You should be ashamed of how you treated her." It was infuriating. I wanted to scream, to defend myself, to set the record straight. But I knew better. These people had already made up their minds, and nothing I said was going to change that. The final straw came one afternoon when I ran into Morgan at a coffee shop. She was sitting at a table with a group of her friends, laughing and chatting like her world hadn't just crumbled. But the moment she saw me, her smile faltered. She excused herself from the group and walked over to me, her tone sickeningly sweet. "Alex," she said, drawing out my name, "how are you doing?" I didn't have the patience for her games. "Cut the act, Morgan," I said coldly. "I know what you've been telling people about me." Her smile vanished, and she crossed her arms defensively. "I'm just telling the truth," she said flatly. "No," I shot back, my voice firm. "You're telling your version of the truth. You're painting me as the bad guy because you can't handle the fact that you ended things and still came out looking bad." Her face flushed red, but she didn't say a word. After a tense pause, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, fists clenched, my blood boiling. By the time I got home, I felt completely drained, like I'd run a marathon of emotional chaos. I sank onto the couch and let the silence of my apartment wrap around me. And that's when it hit me. Something shifted inside me. No matter what Morgan said, no matter how many people believed her lies, I knew the truth. And the people who mattered most, like my mom and Lucas, they knew it too. That was enough. From that moment on, I decided I wasn't going to let Morgan control my life anymore. I blocked her on social media, stopped responding to her friends, and focused on moving forward. It wasn't easy, nothing about it was, but it was the only way I could reclaim my peace. I thought I'd finally closed the chapter on Morgan. But life had other plans. The next blow came from someone I never saw coming, my cousin Jake. Jake and I had always been more like brothers than cousins. We grew up together, inseparable, the kind of bond where we had each other's backs no matter what. He was the guy I turned to for advice, a favor, or just to hang out when life got tough. So when I found out he was seeing Morgan, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The news came from Amber, a mutual friend. One night, I got a text from her that made my stomach drop. "Alex, I don't know if you've heard, but Morgan's been hanging out with Jake. I saw them at a bar together last night." I stared at the screen, rereading the message over and over, trying to make sense of it. It felt impossible. Jake knew everything I'd been through with Morgan. He knew how much she'd hurt me. He'd been there for me during the worst of it. For him to do this, it was the ultimate betrayal. Without even thinking, I called him. He answered on the second ring, his tone casual and unsuspecting. "Hey man, what's up? What the hell is going on with you and Morgan?" I snapped. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. "Alex," he started, his voice quieter now, "I was going to tell you." "Going to tell me when?" "After everyone else already knew." I interrupted, my anger boiling over. "Do you have any idea how messed up this is?" "She reached out to me," he said defensively. "She was struggling after the breakup, and we started talking. One thing led to another. One thing led to another. That's the best you've got." I could feel my chest tightening, anger and disbelief surging through me. "You've been talking to the woman who tore my life apart, and now you're dating her?" "It's not like that," Jake said quickly, his words fumbling. "It just happened." I let out a bitter laugh. "You knew what she did to me, Jake. You knew how much she hurt me, and you still thought it was okay to go there." "She's not the same person with me," he said weakly. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I spat. "That's rich. You stabbed me in the back, Jake, and you think saying you didn't mean to will fix it?" "Alex, come on." "No." I cut him off, my voice ice cold. "Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't even think about trying to justify this. You made your choice, Jake, and now I'm making mine." I hung up before he could say another word. My hands were trembling as I set the phone down, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me. It felt like the walls were closing in. First Morgan, and now Jake. The two people I thought I could trust the most had turned out to be the ones who betrayed me. The next day, there was a knock at my door. I almost didn't answer it. But curiosity and anger got the better of me. When I opened it, there she was. Morgan stood on my doorstep, looking nervous and unsure, like she wasn't even sure why she was there. "I know you're upset," she began, her voice soft. "But I just wanted to explain." "There's nothing to explain," I said flatly, leaning against the doorframe. "You and Jake decided to betray me. What else is there to say?" Her eyes filled with tears, but for once, I didn't feel the slightest shred of sympathy. "It's not like that," she said, her voice shaking. "After we broke up, I was a mess. Jake was just there. He listened to me in a way you never did." My stomach churned, the words hitting me like a slap. "Are you seriously trying to pin this on me?" I asked, my voice rising. "That's not what I'm saying," she replied quickly. "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But Jake and I don't." I cut her off sharply. "Don't try to justify this. You don't get to stand here and pretend this is okay." Her shoulders sagged, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You did. And now you're standing here expecting—what? Forgiveness?" Understanding. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. You made your choices, Morgan. Now live with them. Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks, but I didn't care. I was done letting her manipulate me. Get out, I said, stepping back and motioning to the door. And don't come back. She hesitated for a moment, like she thought I might change my mind, but when I didn't, she nodded and walked away without another word. The next few weeks were brutal. Cutting ties with both Morgan and Jake felt like ripping out pieces of myself. I blocked their numbers and deleted them from my social media, but their absence didn't fill the gaping void they'd left behind. I kept replaying everything in my head, obsessing over every moment, every red flag I might have missed. How had I not seen this coming? But no matter how much I analyzed it, I couldn't make sense of their betrayal. Eventually, I realized I couldn't do this alone anymore. I started therapy, something I'd been avoiding for years. It wasn't easy to open up about everything. The heartbreak, the anger, the crushing feelings of worthlessness. But slowly, my therapist helped me start to see things more clearly. She reminded me of something I hadn't been able to accept. I wasn't responsible for other people's actions. Morgan and Jake had made their choices, and their betrayal said far more about them than it ever did about me.